Throughout his writings, Carl Jung engaged extensively with myths and legends, particularly those with profound religious and mystical meaning. It may therefore seem surprising that he never devoted a full work to the Grail, a symbol of immense importance in the European imagination and one deeply aligned with the themes that concerned him throughout his life. The reason lies in a personal decision. He had promised that he would not write on this subject, as it had been taken up by his wife, Emma Jung, as the central focus of her own long-term work. She dedicated many years, nearly the entirety of her adult life, to this study, working on it for decades. However, she passed away before she could bring it to completion. Near the end of her life, aware that she would not finish the book, she and Carl Jung agreed to entrust the task to Marie-Louise von Franz. In one of her interviews, von Franz speaks specifically on this topic, where she describes how at first, this suggestion presented a difficulty, as it was not originally her work, and she was skeptical on how she would be able to complete it. Yet a dream containing Grail imagery appeared to her, which she understood as a sign that she should take on the responsibility and complete the project. The result is a work that stands alongside the most significant writings associated with Jung, and in my opinion it carries a depth and insight that places it on equal footing with his major contributions. There is also something symbolically meaningful in the division of their intellectual efforts. Just as they were united in life, there appears a kind of inner complementarity in their work, with this subject belonging to her domain. In the previous video, the focus was on Perceval's visit to the Grail castle, including the symbolism of the lance and the sword. Now the attention turns fully to the central image itself, the Grail, the symbol around which the entire tradition is formed. It appears natural that within the maternal realm of the unconscious, understood here as the Grail domain, Perceval would not encounter his personal mother, but rather the mother seen under the aspect of eternity, the primordial image of the mother, the wondrous vessel itself. This image is so evidently a symbol of the feminine, and more specifically of the maternal as that which receives, contains, and sustains, that it scarcely requires extensive illustration. The vessel, in this sense, clearly embodies the maternal principle. When stripped of personal associations and regarded as an object, the vessel no longer represents a concrete human reality, but instead expresses an idea, a primordial image. In this form, it possesses universal meaning and appears across countless myths, legends, and fairy tales, only a small selection of which need be considered here. Its symbolic significance reaches back to the earliest times and may therefore be described as archetypal. As one of the earliest expressions of culture, the vessel is endowed with a magically significant, numinous character. This quality can be seen, for example, in a legend reported by Herodotus concerning Targelaus, the ancestor of the Scythians, in the presence of his sons, 4 objects, a plough, a yoke, an axe, and a bowl, descend from heaven. The 2 elder brothers are unable to take possession of them, for the implements blaze with fire when they attempt to do so. When the youngest son approaches, however, the flames are extinguished. He carries the objects home and is thereafter recognized as king of the entire people. Here, the 4 objects that mark the culture hero are again invested with numinous power. That the vessel is so often regarded as life-giving or life-preserving becomes readily understandable when one considers how vital it must have been for early humanity to possess a container in which water, the substance of life above all others, could be carried or stored. Archetypes may be understood as innate predispositions of the human psyche toward certain patterns of behavior and toward grasping their meaning in particular life situations. The image of the vessel thus corresponds to such a pattern, an inherent psychic possibility of finding or creating a vessel and of discovering its forms and functions. Accordingly, nearly every mythology contains the image of a miraculous vessel. At times it bestows youth and life, at other times it holds healing power, and occasionally, as in the mead cauldron of the Nordic Yma, it grants strength and wisdom. Often, especially in its form as a cooking pot, it brings about transformation. Through this transformative attribute, it achieved exceptional renown in alchemy as the Vas Hermetis. A number of vessels from Celtic legend may be cited that show a closer or looser relationship to the Grail narrative. Irish tradition speaks of the cauldron of Dagda, one of the four treasures of the semi-divine Tuatha de Danann. This cauldron had the power to feed an entire army without ever being emptied. Welsh legend likewise abounds in such vessels. In the magical cauldron of Bran, those who had been slain could be restored to life, though they lost the ability to speak. The cauldron of Ceridwen contained a drink of wisdom and inspiration comparable to the Nordic vessel of insight. Another such receptacle was found at Turnog. When meat intended for a coward was placed inside, it would not cook, whereas meat for a brave man was prepared immediately. The basket of Gwydno Goranhir, known in Welsh as Mvase, belonged to the 13 precious things of the island of Britain. When food sufficient for a single person was placed within it, the basket was found, upon opening, to contain nourishment for 100. According to scholarly interpretation, this object presents the closest parallel to the Grail. From its description, it may be imagined as a kind of basket or chest, and the word itself can also mean a measure. In Old Cornish, related terms signify a table. In Irish usage, the dish upon which the head of John the Baptist was placed bore a related name connected to the Latin word for table, a meaning closely aligned with that of the Grail. It was said that this basket ultimately vanished together with Merlin when he withdrew into his glass house on the Isle of Bardsey. One scholarly view holds that the original model of the Grail was an Irish horn of abundance, and that a word meaning horn later became confused with a term meaning body. Yet another vessel deserves mention. A poem attributed to the Welsh bard Taliesin recounts Arthur's journey to and the underworld, and the seizure from that realm of a vessel that in many respects recalls the Grail. A passage from a poem known as The Plundering of the Underworld illustrates this resemblance. The vessel is described as being kept in a fortress that turns 4 times, gently warmed by the breath of 9 maidens. It is identified as the cauldron of the Otherworld, encircled by a rim of pearls. It will not cook food for the coward or for the breaker of oaths, and punishment awaits such a person. A lamp burns at the gate of the underworld as Arthur and his companions undertake their perilous expedition, from which only 7 return. The pearl-set rim recalls the gem-adorned Grail, which likewise was tended by young women. This vessel, too, denied its blessed gifts to the unworthy. At this point, it is useful to survey briefly the meanings of the word Grail, the forms assumed by the vessel, and the special qualities attributed to it in different traditions. As already noted, one medieval chronicler traced the term back to a Latin word meaning a fairly deep plate or dish. Etymological studies of the Romance languages list related forms in Old French, Provençal, Old Catalan, and other regional tongues, all referring to a vessel, cup, or bowl made of wood, clay, or metal. Related words are still used in parts of southern France to denote various containers, and the French term for basin may also be mentioned. Certain dialects of southern and eastern France continue to preserve the word in a form equivalent to Grail. Another interpretation equates it with a Latinized term found in an imperial will from the late 9th century, where silver vessels with paired spoons are mentioned. One view derives the word from a term for fired clay, since such vessels were made of baked earth, a phrase that also refers to stoneware. This explanation, however, has been judged unlikely by other scholars, who instead argue that the term may originate from the word for a mixing bowl, from which later Romance forms could easily have developed. This latter view has gained increasing acceptance in more recent scholarship. The uncertain derivation of the word Grail from a term meaning stone nevertheless follows a meaningful chain of mythological associations. In Wolfram von Eschenbach, the Grail appears explicitly as a stone said to have descended from heaven and bearing the name Lapsit Exilis. Some interpreted this as the stone of the elixir, while others understood it as a small, insignificant, or inconspicuous stone. Closely related words denote hailstone and hoarfrost, imagery that evokes a round white stone falling from the sky. This association recalls manna and simultaneously suggests the consecrated wafer that was believed to descend from heaven every Good Friday to renew the Grail's nourishing power. At the same time, these words also align with the idea of thinness or leanness, thus corresponding again to the notion of exilis. Another explanation, mentioned by Hellenand of Freudmont more as a popular interpretation, derives Grail from words meaning pleasing, acceptable, grace, goodwill, or reward, and connects it with the French term for what is agreeable or wished for. This interpretation finds repeated confirmation within the Grail romances themselves. In Joseph of Arimathea by Robert de Boron, it is said that the vessel is rightly called the Grail because no one can behold it unless it gives pleasure or satisfaction. In the Didot Perceval, the explanation is given that it is called the Grail because it pleases worthy men. In the Histoire du Saint Grail of the Lancelot Grail cycle, Nashon declares that all his thoughts are fulfilled once he beholds that which exists in all things. Likewise, Merlin, in the poem bearing his name, states that all men call this vessel the Grail because from it they receive grace. Despite the somewhat dismissive judgment of this derivation as merely popular or wordplay, it accords well with the nature of the Grail. On the one hand, the Grail functions as a wishing object. On the other, grace and blessing flow from it. In Wolfram's account, this wish-fulfilling quality is particularly evident. Of the sacred host that is placed upon the stone every Good Friday by a dove, it is said that from this act the stone receives every good fragrance and all nourishment of food and drink found on earth, in a perfection comparable to paradise itself. All that the earth can produce is made present through the Grail's power. This abundance is described again later, where it is said that whatever a person reached out for was immediately found ready before the Grail. Food warm or cold, dishes new or old, meat tame or wild, nothing was lacking. Likewise, whatever drink one might name, whether juice, wine, or another beverage, appeared at once in the cup. All of this occurred through the power of the Grail, which provided hospitality and sustenance to the noble company gathered around it. The Grail thus appears as a true table that sets itself, a horn of plenty, a wishing object or vessel of the kind frequently found in fairy tales in the form of pots, baskets, cups, or cloths. The connection between pleasure, grace, and divine favor on the one hand, and the Christian relic on the other, is evident and corresponds well with the conception of the Grail as such a sacred object. Another proposed explanation, though certainly incorrect, interprets the frequently used form sangreal as royal blood, meaning the blood of Christ believed to be contained in the Grail. A further explanation, advocated for example by Paul in Paris, suggests that the name Grail arose because the story was originally included in a gradual, a liturgical book used in church services and named after a hymn arranged in musical steps. In truth, the clear and well-supported derivation from a word-meaning dish would be sufficient, were it not inherent in the nature of the Grail that new associations with its meaning are constantly sought. It is striking how this tendency is reflected in language itself. Words appear related or intuitively relevant, and even when such connections cannot be demonstrated scientifically, they nevertheless express the ambiguity of the object in a way that feels meaningful and allows its many aspects to emerge. All of this indicates that the Grail is far more than a simple vessel. It is a symbol. Further illustrations of how the meaning of the word changed over time are provided in a study by Wilhelm Hertz. As a term denoting the highest value, the word Grail appears in religious songs and in medieval love lyrics. Mary is compared to the Grail, and even God himself is called the highest Grail. The beloved is described as the Grail of the heart, and a pure woman is spoken of as the Grail for which one must strive and fight. Gradually, however, the word came to signify more and more a banquet or festive entertainment. Toward the end of the 13th century, a play about a young woman named Frau Fee, whose name derives from wisdom, was performed in Magdeburg. It took the form of a tournament, and a camp called the Grail was erected. In Brunswick, the Grail became an important popular festival held every 7 years and celebrated for the last time toward the end of the 15th century. The verb derived from the word came to mean loud, rejoicing, or bawling. In the following century, related expressions meaning to make a cheerful noise entered common usage, and to go to the Grails meant to attend a feast. Even in religious poetry, the Grail was transformed into a place of delight. In an old prayer from Bremen, the 11,000 virgins dance in a heavenly Grail before the Virgin Mary. Over time, however, the word acquired a more dubious colouring. Toward the end of the 15th century, the Dutch chronicler Veldenaer wrote that some chroniclers claimed the Knight of the Swan, Lohengrin, came from the Grail, which was once thought to be the earthly paradise. He added that this place was not paradise at all, but a sinful realm entered through perilous adventure and left only through further trials and good fortune. A chronicler from Halberstadt reported that historians believed the Knight of the Swan came from the mountain where Venus dwells in the Grail. According to legend, in the round mountain of St. Barbara near ep.II, there lived a great company of enchanted men and women, condemned to spend their lives in dancing and sensual excess until the day of judgment. Among German speakers of the 16th century, both the legend and the word gradually disappeared from everyday language. In an 18th century German Latin dictionary by Johann Leonard Frisch, the entry for Grail describes it merely as an old play performed with dancing and shouting. From this development it follows, quite rightly, that the Grail is an archetypal symbol of multiple and shifting meanings. Just as the word itself is unmistakably ambiguous and subject to shifts in meaning, so too the Grail and the events surrounding it are never presented in exactly the same way. One often gains the clear impression that, once the theme emerged, the imagination set to work without restraint, endlessly inventing new arrangements and combinations. This proliferation resembles the abundance of ornaments, flowers, animals, saints, and monsters found in Gothic cathedrals. The development of such varied styles and the continual transformation of the material testify to the fact that it possesses an inner psychic vitality of its own, one that resists being fixed in a single, definitive form. In Chrétien de Troyes, the object is introduced simply as a grail, not yet as the Grail, since the term at that stage denoted a particular kind of vessel. Later, it is described as being made of pure gold, set with precious stones, and radiating such brilliant light that nearby candles pale in comparison. It is not stated explicitly that the Grail provides food. Rather, it is said that with each course the uncovered vessel is carried past those seated at the table. In other versions, however, it clearly does nourish those present. In the account of Gauvain's visit to the Grail castle, the object is called the rich Grail, and it is emphasized that it moves around the table serving food without being carried by any visible hand. In later continuations of the romances focused on Perceval, as well as in most other versions, the Grail is explicitly identified as the vessel used by Christ at the Last Supper and later entrusted to Joseph of Arimathea. In these more religiously oriented accounts, the Grail also dispenses food. While imprisoned, Joseph of Arimathea is miraculously sustained and comforted by it, and the same occurs during his later wanderings with his family. In the Quest del Saint Graal, the Grail appears in a wondrous fashion at Whitsuntide, just as King Arthur is about to sit down to supper with his knights. A clap of thunder is heard, followed by a dazzling ray of light. The Grail then enters the hall, covered in white velvet and borne by no one, filling the chamber with a sweet fragrance. As it moves around the table, each person receives exactly the food he desires. In The Crown by Heinrich von dem Terlin, the Grail is described as a reliquary casket containing a piece of bread, 1/3 of which is given to the Grail King. Alongside this appears a vessel, likely a beaker, holding 3 drops of blood, an unmistakable allusion to the Eucharistic sacrament. This symbolism becomes fully explicit in works of an openly religious character, where the Grail, now called the Holy Vessel, is identified with the chalice or ciborium of the Mass, and the service of the Grail is equated with the Mass itself. In Chrétien's account, Perceval learns from a hermit that the Grail contains the sacred host that sustains the aged king. From the vessel holding the blood of Christ to the chalice of the Mass, the symbolic transition is therefore a very small one. In the Pearl's Vows, King Arthur is present at a Grail service conducted by several hermits. The narrative relates that at that time there was no chalice in Arthur's realm. During the mystery of the Mass, the Grail manifested itself in 5 forms, which may not be described, since no one is permitted to speak of the mystery of the sacrament unless divinely authorized to do so. Arthur witnessed all these transformations, the final one being the appearance of a chalice. The hermit who had celebrated the Mass then discovered a letter upon the corporal cloth, declaring that it was the will of God that his body should be consecrated to his memory in that cup. The meaning of the blood has already been considered. along with the mysterious and numinous effect that the idea of a relic containing the blood of Christ must have exerted upon people of that era. Yet it is not only the veneration of Christ's blood and the attempt to comprehend its significance that evoke deep emotional and archaic responses. The symbol of the vessel in which the blood is preserved naturally produces an equally powerful impression. The notion that soul substance should be kept in a funerary vessel corresponds to a profoundly archetypal conception rooted in antiquity and in Eastern traditions. At the burial of certain African chieftains, for example, the bodily fluids released after death are collected in a leather container and buried separately, being regarded as especially sacred. According to indigenous belief, the animal that embodies the soul of the deceased and represents the continued existence of the soul of their kings emerges from this vessel. In a similar manner, Egyptian burial rites required that the perishable parts of the dead pharaoh's body be interred separately in 4 canopic jars. These vessels were usually sealed with lids shaped as the heads of the 4 sons of Horus, who were believed to bring about the resurrection and ascension of their grandfather and to act as agents in the resurrection of Osiris. In later periods, Osiris himself was depicted as a vessel with a human head. It is as though the container held the magical soul substance of the god, and it therefore seems appropriate to attribute a comparable meaning to the Grail. The vessel containing the blood of Christ thus emerges as a symbol with complete spontaneity. It constitutes the central motif of the narrative, the Grail motif itself. It appears as though the vessel contains the living remnant of Christ and his soul substance, that element through which a mystical continuation of his being becomes possible. For this reason, a connection with the myth of Osiris cannot be dismissed outright, particularly since a tradition points in this direction, namely the legend of the Abbey of Fécamp. In this legend, Nicodemus scrapes the dried blood from Christ's wounds with a knife and conceals it first in his glove and later in a lead container, described as a small cylinder. He hides this container within the trunk of a fig tree, because of an impending invasion of Sidon, where he is living, and in obedience to a divine command, he entrusts the tree to the sea. It is carried westward and eventually washed ashore on the coast of Normandy near Fécamp. There the trunk takes root once more and puts forth leaves. Because of the extraordinary effects emanating from the site, a church and later a monastery are founded there, although the holy blood concealed in the trunk remains undiscovered for a long time. The resemblance between this account and the Grail legend is striking, not only in its details, but also in the fact that in both cases the vessel containing the holy blood remains hidden for an extended period and becomes known only through the strange effects it produces. The Fécamp legend clearly recalls the myth of Osiris as reported by Plutarch, in which the coffin of Osiris is washed ashore at Byblos in Phoenicia, the land associated with the fig tree, and is concealed within a bush that grows up around it. It therefore appears likely that traces of the Osiris myth persist within the Grail narrative. Even if no direct historical connection exists, the same archetypal pattern seems to have manifested itself once again. The aspect of the Grail as a sepulchral symbol is especially clear in the version by Robert de Boron. In the Latin version of the Gospel of Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea asks Christ, who appears to him in prison, to prove that he is truly the Saviour by showing him where his body was laid. Christ then takes Joseph by the hand and leads him to the grave. In the Grail version, however, Christ instead hands Joseph the cup, thereby implying that the Grail is equivalent to the grave itself. At this point, the Grail story departs from the Gospel of Nicodemus and follows its own distinctive path. At the time when the Grail legend took shape, the idea of the Holy Sepulchre powerfully stirred the emotions of the age, and it was this idea that supplied such intense motivating force to the Crusades, if it did not in fact give rise to them outright. The task of liberating the Holy Sepulchre from non-Christian powers formed the central objective of the undertaking. This dimension of the Grail motif, and the way in which the literal recovery of the Holy Sepulchre gradually turned into an inner, spiritual goal, has been compellingly clarified by Helen Adolphe. She also emphasized the Holy Sepulchre as the place where the mystery of resurrection occurred, thereby endowing the grave with an especially numinous quality. In every age and culture, sacred graves have been venerated because of the blessed influence believed to emanate from the remains of those buried within them. In the case of Christ's sepulchre, however, the situation is unique, since Christ was resurrected and the grave was therefore left empty. Moreover, its historical authenticity is uncertain, as tradition holds that it had been filled with rubble and was rediscovered only through a miracle several centuries later, when Constantine the Great ordered excavations. During the intervening period, pagan sanctuaries had occupied the site. Yet despite this, the sepulchre came to be regarded as the most important object of devotion in Christendom. This was not because of its concrete physical reality, but because something far more significant lay behind it, a symbol or an idea. The great enigma of death has occupied the human mind since the earliest times, as is evident from the many meanings attached to its visible and enduring expression, the grave. The cult of the grave is among the earliest manifestations of religious belief, and appears among nearly all peoples and at widely differing levels of cultural development. In the non-Christian worlds of China, India, and Tibet, the graves of saints are accorded great importance, while in Islam the most sacred place is the grave of the Prophet. The grave also plays a major role in popular superstition, where it is credited with a wide range of magical powers. In fairy tales and legends, wondrous events frequently occur in connection with graves. In the German version of the story of Cinderella, for example, the mother's grave grants wishes, and beautiful garments or golden apples fall from the tree growing above it. Generally, the burial place is regarded as the dwelling of the dead, from which the deceased or the spirit may continue to exert influence. It was said of the Tuatha De Danann that they withdrew into burial mounds, where they continued to live and from which they occasionally appeared to humans. As already noted, every consecrated altar in a Roman Catholic church must contain relics, and thus also functions as a grave. Often it is even shaped like a sarcophagus. Like the vessel, the grave carries a maternal meaning, for the mother is not only the place of birth but also, as Mother Earth, the one who receives the dead back into herself. The primal image of the mother is especially suited to this dual aspect of life and death. Both the life-bestowing aspect, which provides food and drink, and the aspect of death and the grave are united in the Grail. The mystery of coming into being and passing away is bound up with the image of the mother, which explains why rituals concerned with this process were linked to the cults of mother goddesses such as Isis and Demeter. The great and truly vital mystery of the death and resurrection of the God also stands at the very center of the Christian faith. Through the sacrificial death of Christ, the believer is assured not only of the forgiveness of sins, but also of resurrection and eternal life. The notion that new life arises through sacrifice, particularly through bloody sacrifice, reaches back to the earliest beginnings of humanity. The life-giving power of the Grail is therefore conditioned in a twofold way, on the one hand through its maternal significance, and on the other through the sacrificial blood it contains. If the narrative now places special emphasis on the vessel in its meaning as a grave, and above all as the grave of Christ, this is because it was there that the mysterious transition from death to life, the resurrection, occurred. In the same way, the Eucharistic chalice is the place where the ineffable mystery of transformation is fulfilled. This event is represented in the Mass as eternally taking place, just as the alternation of life and death forms an unending rhythm. The idea that the communion cup signifies the grave of Christ, and thus the place of both his death and resurrection, appears to have been familiar in the Middle Ages. This is suggested by a passage from Honorius of Orton, which explains that when the priest pronounces the concluding words of the liturgy, the deacon lifts the chalice, partially covers it with a cloth, returns it to the altar, and then covers it with the corporal. In doing so, he reenacts the role of Joseph of Arimathea, who took the body of Christ down from the cross, covered it, laid it in the grave, and sealed it with a stone. The corporal represents the burial cloth, the chalice signifies the grave, and the pattern symbolizes the stone placed before it. In the narrative under consideration, the Grail vessel is likewise portrayed as a foreshadowing of the communion cup, and the service of the Grail as analogous to the Mass, yet it differs from the Mass in an essential respect. Instead of a sacrifice, another kind of transformation takes place. The wine does not need to be changed, since the sacrificial blood is already present in the vessel, and there is no clearly recognizable enactment of a death and resurrection mystery. Perceval's assumption of responsibility for the Grail might be interpreted as a renewal of the Fisher King, particularly since the king dies after installing his successor. In this version of the legend, as in most others, the wounded king is healed and described as fully transformed as soon as Perceval asks the decisive question, only to die 3 days later. Such an interpretation, however, remains superficial. The familiar pattern in which the son simply takes the place of the father is far too commonplace to convey the transformation intended by the mystery of resurrection. The symbols therefore demand a deeper exploration, which requires attention to another aspect of the grave. The grave cannot be understood solely as the place of transformation and resurrection. It must also be regarded as the condition of being dead or buried. It seems that precisely this aspect carries particular weight in the story. In the grave, life has vanished. It is no longer visible, but hidden. This leads to another ancient conception, that of the hidden treasure, and to a related sequence of ideas. Hidden treasure is a favored motif in legends and fairy tales. According to popular belief, such treasure is imagined as lying within the earth, in places where the grass grows more richly, where snow never settles, where a meteorite has fallen, or where the rainbow touches the ground. The recovery of buried treasure is made difficult by its ability to change location. It is said to move away, to grow, or to rise and sink. It comes to the surface only once in many centuries, and at that moment announces itself through small blue flames known as treasure fire. This appearance usually occurs at night, and only at certain auspicious times suitable for digging. The treasure is often not recognized, since it may appear in the form of a worthless object. The riches hidden underground are rarely unguarded. They are watched over either by benevolent or malevolent spirits, who may assist or obstruct their removal. Most commonly the guardian is the devil, though at times it is restless souls or small grey beings who acquired gold unjustly and are therefore condemned to remain bound to the treasure until it is unearthed. Their redemption depends upon the successful recovery of the hoard. Frequently, this task is destined for a specific individual of a particular age and character. Heroes who are said to have withdrawn into mountains, such as Frederick Barbarossa or King Arthur, are likewise imagined as dwelling within these treasure mountains. The typical motifs associated with the land of the dead also appear in legends of treasure mountains, for these places were originally conceived as the abodes of the deceased. Belief in hidden treasure is therefore rooted in the custom of burial offerings, and the earliest treasure legends were likely stories of grave robbing. The Grail itself has already been seen as a treasure of this kind. It reveals itself only at a particular time, and only one chosen person is capable of finding it. There is little doubt that this deeply ingrained notion of hidden treasure contributed to the powerful response evoked by the call to liberate the Holy Sepulchre. These ideas are not without reason so firmly cherished by the imagination. They are profoundly embedded and should not be dismissed as mere childish wish fulfillment. The instinct of the treasure seeker is not directed solely toward material objects, for there exist treasures of another order, which can be imagined in many different forms. The idea of being dead or buried as a psychic condition is sometimes reflected in philosophical thought. In the Gorgias, Plato has Socrates remark that life is a strange condition, and that it may be true, as Euripides suggested, that life is death and death life. He adds that a wise man once said that human beings are already dead, and that the body is a tomb. A similar meaning is expressed in the saying of Heraclitus, that mortals live the death of the immortals, while the immortals live the death of mortals. Closely related is the Christian doctrine that regards the body as a prison. This idea was elaborated with particular richness in Gnostic systems, which described the descent of the soul into the material world and its imprisonment there, and most notably in the teachings of Moni, shaped by Zoroastrian influence. Moni taught that the opposing realms of light and darkness have existed from eternity, and that the entire material world, together with all living things within it, constitutes the grave of the light element that has been lost or confined there. Redemption consists in liberating this light from the darkness of matter and restoring it to the realm of light. Attention has often been drawn to the possibility that these Gnostic ideas found their way into the Grail narratives through the traditions of the Cathars and Albigensians. The idea of the hidden treasure reaches its most comprehensive and distinctive development in alchemy. In this tradition, the underlying assumption is that something precious, namely a spirit, is concealed or bound within matter, the so-called primal substance or base material, and that the task of the royal art consists in releasing or transforming it. From the alchemical perspective, being dead and buried, an otherwise incomprehensible state of existence, is regarded as the fundamental condition and the point of departure for the work, in contrast to the common view that death and burial occur at the end of life. From this standpoint, it follows that the life shaped through the opus, or through the Grail, was not identical with visible, physical existence. In a similar way, the empty grave of Christ signified the dawning of a new life, conditioned in a different manner. This difference did not refer to a life after death, but rather to a form of existence unfolding within this life, though on another level. It is natural to assume that what is buried or hidden simply points to something unconscious that needs only to be uncovered, like a treasure brought up into the light of day. The image of an empty grave, however, suggests something further. It may refer to something so concealed and invisible that it is as though it had never existed at all, something that does not merely need to be uncovered, but in a certain sense must first come into being. This would correspond to the other life mentioned earlier, not the natural life of the body bound to nature, but the life of the inner person that transcends nature, the encompassing personality that Carl Jung called the self. In the dreams and fantasy images of modern individuals, this hidden and invisible element is sometimes represented as a meaningful and numinous emptiness. One such image depicts an egg-shaped void from which rays emerge, forming the center of a world or of a mandala with an empty core. The words of Meister Eckhart give eloquent expression to the meaning of this image. Everything must be relinquished, and the soul must exist in unimpeded nothingness. Whoever would approach God must come as nothing. In Eastern symbolism, this same idea is expressed in the image of a deity of utmost emptiness and life, dwelling in a luminous inner hall, while Confucian teaching speaks of the center of the void. Nothingness, or emptiness, thus appears as an unavoidable condition for the emergence of the self. The self is not present from the outset in a clearly graspable form, but reveals itself only through the outer and inner realizations of a life lived through to its completion. For this reason, Jung compared it to a crystal lattice that exists as a potential structure within a solution, becoming visible only through the process of crystallization, which may or may not actually occur. The self is therefore not complete in advance, but exists within the individual as a potential that can become manifest only through a particular process. It is also clear that the self is not necessarily realized through the mere unfolding of natural biological life. There are many lives in which this realization does not take place. The self becomes manifest through the way it is lived in the experience of daily life. Its appearance in symbolic form in dreams or inner images, the attainment of a particular clarity of consciousness, or the high differentiation of a psychological function are not by themselves sufficient for its realization. While consciousness is undoubtedly important, and, when rightly used, provides an invaluable aid for the manifestation of the self, it is not the decisive factor. The realization of the self does not depend primarily on knowledge, ability, or intelligence, but on how these qualities are used and, above all, on the psychic attitude a person assumes in facing the circumstances of life and fate. Just as threads are woven into a pattern to form a fabric, the self, as the living garment of divinity, is woven from the many decisions and crises, seemingly insignificant in themselves, that shape a life. These occasions arise at every level of life and intelligence, in every milieu. Whether they lead to a manifestation of the self depends entirely on the response of the individual. Observations show that even small children, when confronted with difficulty, often display an attitude that many adults might envy. That something which adults sometimes find lacking, experienced as soullessness, is as someone who takes a stance, feels accountable, and accepts commitment. Where this higher, responsible ego is absent, the self cannot emerge. Ethos and the self are therefore mutually dependent. For this reason, an attitude of indifference to moral distinctions, such as has been advocated in modern times and particularly since Nietzsche, is particularly likely to prevent the emergence of the self. From this, it becomes evident that a fascination can radiate from something empty. It longs for completion like an invisible form calling for substance. The individual may sense this summons and feel its attraction, without knowing precisely what calls to him. The influence emanating from the hidden Grail could be understood in this way, as a silent summons to something yet unseen. Another characteristic of the Grail is its ability to distinguish between the righteous and sinners, as its beneficial effects are perceived only by the former. A vessel with a similar discriminating function is found in Celtic mythology. Manawydan, son of Lyre and a sea divinity, owned a cup among other precious objects that would break whenever a lie was spoken. A similar motif appears in an old Irish tale, the vessel of Bad Earn. Bad Earn was the name of a king. On one occasion, his wife went to a fountain and saw two women carrying a bronze chain emerge from the fairy hills. When they noticed her approaching, they vanished into the water. She followed them and, in their home, discovered a marvelous vessel of crystal. This cup had the peculiarity that if anyone spoke 3 lies, it divided into 3 parts in their hand, but when 3 true words were spoken, the pieces rejoined. Badon's wife requested the vessel, and Bad Earn retained it to distinguish truth from falsehood. This illustrates that the Grail, like the vessel in Celtic tales, functions not merely as a source of sustenance or power, but as a discerning instrument, revealing the moral quality of those who approach it. Through its breaking, the vessel signaled that a lie had been spoken, and through its reunification it bore witness to the truth, as though illustrating how an individual's soul is similarly affected by words. One who lies deceives oneself and experiences disintegration, whereas one who speaks truth restores and makes the soul whole. This recalls the Hermetic notion of a vessel filled with understanding and consciousness, sent from heaven to earth, so that those who immerse themselves in it might comprehend the purpose for which they were created. A vessel of this kind also played a role in the Gnostic mystery rites of late antiquity. In one illustration, a bowl appears to originate from an Orphic community. 16 naked men and women, standing in reverent, worshipful postures, encircle a coiled, winged serpent, the symbol of the Redeemer and Son of God in Orphic Gnosis. The serpent guides them toward the development of consciousness. In Gnostic texts, it is said that no one can be saved or rise again without the Son, represented as the serpent, who brings the paternal models down from above and returns to heaven those awakened from sleep who have reassumed the features of the Father. In this way, the Logos serpent is clearly worshipped within the vessel by the initiates. Similarly, the Gnostic Noscenes described a vessel called the cup of Anacreon, which mediated knowledge of God. They believed in an original androgynous being who needed redemption from matter. This being was called the heavenly horn of the moon, and in a state of ecstatic vision, the worshippers declared, "Bring water here, boy, bring wine, immerse me in stupor and frenzy, my tankard tells me, speaking in mute silence, what I must become." It is probable that later legends, such as the Persian-Arabic cup of Jamshid, in which all the mysteries of the world could be perceived, and the tales of Solomon's miraculous cup, trace their origin to these Gnostic sources. The writer Ibn Malik recounts a vision of Muhammad, which Muhammad instructed Malik to describe as follows: "On the night when I ascended to heaven, I glimpsed, beneath a canopy, a goblet of such penetrating brightness that all the 7 heavens were illuminated by it. Around the goblet was a prayer written in green characters. A voice declared, 'O Muhammad, the all-highest God has created this goblet for thy enlightenment.'" Evidence that Gnostic traditions persisted into the early Middle Ages is found in the Coffrets Gnostiques, boxes discovered in Provence, which depict naked initiates. Gnostic cult objects, likely transmitted through Arabic and especially Sabaean influence, reached Sicily, Spain, and southern France. It is therefore plausible that some of the influences shaping the Grail legend could have originated from these regions. The vision of the Gnostic alchemist Zosimos of Panopolis in Egypt, who lived in the 3rd century, shows a cosmic altar in the form of a bowl, which is related to the vessel mentioned in the Hermetic corpus, where men acquire consciousness. In a dream, Zosimo saw a shallow bowl in which men in torment were being cooked and thereby sublimated into a state of spirituality. In another work, he mentions the crater of Poimandres, instructing his mystical sister to immerse herself in it. The crater functions as a font in which immersion affects transformation into a spiritual being, becoming the hermetic vessel of later alchemy, the uterus of spiritual renewal or rebirth. Some scholars even suggest that this hermetic crater was the source of Wolfram's idea of the Grail, possibly reaching Spain via the Sabaeans and coming to the attention of the mysterious Kayat, Wolfram's alleged source. In alchemy, the vessel is sometimes identical with its contents. The 15th century text Rosarium states, "One is the stone, one the medicine, one the vessel, one the procedure, and one the disposition," while the Aurora Consurgens declares that the vessel is the permanent water, the arcane substance itself. A Latin translation of a Sabaean text, Liber Quartorum, emphasizes that the vessel is like the work of God in the vessel of the divine seed, for it has received the clay, molded it, and mixed it with water and fire. This alludes both to the creation of man and, immediately afterward, to the creation of souls from the seeds of heaven. To contain the soul, God created the vas cerebi, the cranium. Thus, the symbol of the vessel is also applied to the soul. Caesarius of Heisterbach provides a striking example. The soul is a spiritual substance of spherical nature, like the globe of the moon, or like a glass vessel that is furnished before and behind with eyes and sees the whole universe. In this conception, the vessel, or soul, has a direct relation to the cosmos and its creation. The emergence of human consciousness can be likened to the Genesis account of creation. On the first day, God separated light from darkness, calling the light day and the darkness night. Psychologically, this can be understood as the moment when the light of consciousness arose from the undifferentiated chaos, while the unconscious, night, simultaneously came into existence as a distinct and independent counterpart to consciousness. The term unconscious presupposes the presence of consciousness, for without it there can be no unconscious. Small children, for example, do not possess an individual unconscious because their consciousness is not yet developed. They exist in a dreamlike, twilight state, gradually awakening into progressively higher levels of consciousness oriented toward the external world. With the rise of consciousness, the unconscious also emerges. Following the Genesis narrative further, on the fourth day, after the firmament has been established to separate the waters above from those below, and the lower waters have been gathered to form the seas so that dry land may appear and bring forth vegetation, God declares, "Let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, for seasons, for days, and for years, and let them give light upon the earth." God then creates two great lights, the greater to rule the day, the lesser to rule the night, along with the stars. Psychologically, the great light of day, the sun, may be compared to the mind, while the lesser light ruling the night corresponds to the soul. Once the earth, symbolizing solidity and consciousness, has been separated from the seas, representing the fluctuating, surging unconscious, the soul arises as if emerging from the water. This is the being worshipped in antiquity as Aphrodite, the foam-born, still revered as Stella Maris. In Breton stories, Morgan, the sea-born fairy, skilled in magic and healing, governs the otherworldly realm of the unconscious and dreams. She is the lady soul whom chivalric heroes saw and sought behind the real woman, often serving and honoring her unknowingly. In a profound sense, the attainment of the soul was a central concern of that age. Following the analogy of Genesis, the soul, the light of night, appears only after a world capable of assimilating it has been created. By the rise of Christianity, Western humanity had evidently reached this stage. The growing awareness of the soul coincided with this period, and the soul was accorded the highest value in the Christian worldview. The role of suffering and the passion in Christianity demonstrates the inclusion and significance of the feminine element, portraying the soul as the organ of suffering. Tertullian saying, "Anima naturalita Christiana," the soul is Christian by nature, reflects this understanding. During the Middle Ages, the process of realizing or becoming conscious of the soul intensified, manifesting not only in religion but also in the secular practice of Menedienst, which bore a pronouncedly religious character. In this way, the process ultimately returned full circle to its true foundation, the soul. Adam de Saint Victor composed a beautiful song during the period when the Grail stories were emerging, expressing a spirit entirely in harmony with their meaning. Salve Mater Salvatoris, chosen vessel, vase of honor, vase of heaven's grace, foreseen from eternity, noted vessel, vessel carved by wisdom's hand. In this context, the soul is understood as that wondrous vessel which forms the ultimate goal of the quest, containing the life-giving power whose deepest secret must remain concealed, for its essence is a mystery. In the same era, alchemists, seeking the soul in matter, were devoted to this very mystery. The vessel in alchemy functions as a true symbol, representing a mystical idea and carrying extensive connections of meaning. Ancient legendary writers describe it as the hermetic vessel, asserting that the whole secret lies in knowing it. The vessel is always one and must be round, like the vault of heaven, so that celestial influences may contribute to the work. It is often described as a matrix or uterus, in which the son of the philosophers is born, while simultaneously being, in a mysterious way, identical with its contents. It is the aqua permanens, the Mercurius described as our true hidden vessel, and also the philosophical garden in which our sun rises and ascends. The vessel itself is the lapis philosophorum, gathering and uniting dispersed matter. Psychologically, it can be interpreted as a concept, not arbitrarily imposed by consciousness, but arising from the unconscious itself through careful observation. In this sense, it is a theoria in which the unconscious explains itself. Modern depth psychology has rediscovered a similar approach in the use of unconscious manifestations as a vessel to assimilate their contents. This method, called active imagination, is defined as an active evocation of inner images according to their nature. It is not aimless fantasy, but a deliberate attempt to apprehend the meaning of inner objects as faithfully reproduced mental images. The process generates symbolic stories or dialogues with an inner partner representing the unconscious, fostering a synthesis between the conscious and unconscious aspects of the personality. Consciousness develops an attitude willing to consider, understand, and incorporate these contents into real life. In this way, the individual becomes a vessel for the inflowing contents of the unconscious. German mystics similarly use the term vase, to signify man in this sense. The connection between the alchemical vessel and visual understanding is emphasized by statements such as that of Senior, cited in 16th century writings, that the vision of the hermetic vessel is to be sought more than the scripture. By beholding the vessel, one attains vos, a higher consciousness contained within it. Thus, the vessel also functions as a uterus for the spiritual renewal or rebirth of the individual. In early times, the contents of the vessel, the arcane substance, were already likened to the waters of the Nile or to the dismembered Osiris, acknowledging its secret and divine nature. The vessel thus also represents an inner readiness to engage with the archetype of the self. For the peoples of northwestern Europe, Christianity came from the distant and more advanced Mediterranean culture, grafted onto their own primitive and less developed mentality. Lacking the intellectual tools or differentiated thinking to grasp its meaning, they had no choice but to allow this foreign faith to sink deeply into the soul, where it animated a latent archetype. In this way, it was assimilated more fundamentally and securely than it could have been by understanding based solely on intellect or feeling. Whether this process of spiritual appropriation occurs on a large or small scale, in the collective or the individual, it is inevitably accompanied by a profusion of associations from the individual soul, for assimilation consists precisely of such contributions. These are not automatically orthodox. They do not necessarily fit into a consciously defined, universally valid framework, but emerge as they exist in the soul of the person or race concerned. Even if such unorthodox ideas are condemned as heretical by a church concerned with maintaining a uniform creed, they retain great importance because they actively serve the process of assimilation. A new realization becomes alive and effective only when it reaches beyond the limits of consciousness into the depths of the soul and unites there with a corresponding archetype. The feminine and maternal symbol of the vessel can be understood in this sense as a place, like a mother's womb, where previously invisible or merely intellectual factors acquire life and form. There is a connection here with the notion that, after its arrival in Britain, the Grail fell into captivity or disappeared into a beyond, into concealment, a situation that can be viewed as a form of incubation. Medieval alchemy, like the Grail legend, mirrors a similar process of assimilating Christianity, a process that simultaneously reshapes and develops Christian contents. For this reason, the vessel signifies not only the possibility of psychic assimilation, but also serves as a matrix in which the archetype of the self undergoes further transformation. On this account, with its divine content, the alchemical vessel holds the value of a mystery. An old text, Practica Mariae, describes the vessel as the measure of your fire, and notes that the Stoics had concealed it because it was the toxic body that transformed the mercurius, the water of the philosophers. As the arcane substance, the vessel embodies not only water but also fire. In the words of the Allegorii Sapientum, thus our stone, that is the flask of fire, is created from fire. The dangerous and fiery nature of the alchemical vessel is also characteristic of the Grail. In the Lancelot Grail, Mordrain, a companion of Joseph who approached the Grail too closely, is deprived of sight and the use of his limbs, becoming utterly helpless like the Fisher King. On another occasion, Lancelot enters the Grail castle, drawn by a bright glow to a room where the holy vessel stands on a silver table. Coming too close, he feels a breath of hot wind scorch his face. His hearing and sight vanish, and he falls as if dead. He loses the power of speech and remains unable to move or speak for 24 days and nights. This motif demonstrates that the Grail represents a genuine mystery. In many mystery cults of antiquity, sacred objects were kept hidden in baskets and were forbidden to the uninitiated. Similarly, among primitive peoples, the fetish or the contents of a war bundle or medicine bag were treated with secrecy, and anyone who looked upon them out of curiosity faced consequences. In this way, the overwhelming, dangerous quality and numinous essence of the archetypal content find expression. This may explain why the Grail book and its mysteries were shrouded in such extraordinary taboo. For example, in Watchier's continuation, it is said, "Of all the marvels which he found and which so often he did fear, may no one speak a word. Whoever speaks of them will be in peril, for 'tis the secret of the Grail, and evil can befall the man who talks of it in any way except the way it should be told." In another passage, the Elucidation, it is stated, about the Grail, of whose mystery none may speak or tell. The Grail, like the alchemical vessel, is thus an object of profound mystery, dangerous, sacred, and accessible only to those who approach it with the proper reverence and understanding. In Robert de Boron, it is said of the book, "There the great mystery is written, which is called the Grail." Strikingly, the alchemical idea of the vessel being identical with its contents, the stone, appears in the Grail story as well. In Wolfram von Eschenbach, the Grail is called a stone, described as, "Upon a deep green Ochmadi, she bore the perfection of paradise, both root and branch. This was a thing called the Grail, which surpasses all earthly perfection." Further on, it is said, "They live from a stone of purest kind. If you do not know it, it shall here be named to you. It is called lapsit exilis." This lapsit exilis has prompted much speculation. Some read it as lapsit ex Celes, leading to the idea that the Grail might be a meteorite, for in antiquity meteorites were regarded as stones with a soul. According to Wolfram Kayat, the Grail was discovered by Phlegetanes, a pagan natural scientist who observed it in the stars. Many scholars identify Phlegetanes with the mystic Thubit ben Qurra of Baghdad, who lived in the 9th century, translated Greek alchemical writings, and appears in Latin alchemical texts as Thebede. Others argue that the Arabic for Phlegetanes, Phelekthoni, refers to the guardian of the second planet, Mercury. According to Wolfram, Phlegetanes' writings were later found by the Provençal Kayat in Dolit, and after extensive research, Kayat discovered a chronicle in Anjou that agreed with Phlegetanes' account. This single source clearly points to Arabic or Sabaean astrology and alchemy. The alchemist's stone was also explicitly called the lapis exilis in some verses attributed to Arnold of Villanova, and in the 15th century Rosarium Philosophorum. This insignificant stone is indeed of trifling value. It is despised by fools, the more cherished by the wise. As Arnold was likely born around 1220, Wolfram, who wrote earlier, could not have borrowed the term from him, but astrological and alchemical concepts were certainly familiar to him. Many scholars therefore interpret lapsit exilis as lapis elixir. Vincent of Beauvais, around 1260, also refers to the philosopher's stone of the alchemists under this name when quoting Avicenna's De Arte Alchemia. While the text does not use the term directly, it does compare the lapis to the elixir. Lapis elixir, however, was already a well-known alchemical term. Extremely significant and closely tied to alchemical ideas is the belief, according to Wolfram, that the Grail stone remained on earth, guarded by those angels who had remained neutral in the conflict between God and Satan. These angels, sometimes called the Doubters, were compelled to descend to earth and keep watch over the stone. They were noble and worthy, taking neither side during the struggle between Lucifer and the Trinity. This notion, common in certain medieval mystical traditions, seems to stem from Cathar circles. These angels opposed the tearing apart of divine inner opposites, seeking to preserve balance and maintain the original unity of the God image, and it is they who now guard the Grail. In alchemy, the lapis represents a similar unity of light and dark, a harmonization of divine opposites. The alchemical Mercurius, identified with a stone, is also considered duplex, virtuous with the righteous, harmful to sinners. He embodies a God image in which opposites coexist, Christ and devil, masculine and feminine, twin, simultaneously Adam and Eve, old man and boy. He represents the anthropos, the savior arising from the unconscious, who completes and compensates the light figure of Christ. As such, he is a deus terrestris et absconditus, an essential aspect of the self, the God image embodying a complexio oppositorum. The figure of Baphomet, said to have been venerated by the Templars, similarly represents this comprehensive light-dark God image. Baphomet was described as androgynous, with two faces and a long silver-grey beard, or with a copper head, answering questions in an oracular manner. Some of these secret traditions survived with the Knights Hospitallers in Rhodes, where they were rediscovered by the alchemist Bernard of Treviso and integrated with his own alchemical concepts. Through such indirect routes, mystical ideas from certain Gnostic-influenced Oriental sects appear to have entered European spiritual thought, often combined with alchemical ideas. Wolfram's source, Guyot Kayet, is said to have travelled in Jerusalem and at the court of Frederick Barbarossa, gaining personal experience with the Templars, who were considered guardians of Solomon's temple. In this literature, Solomon appears as an archetypally magnified old wise man, united with the Queen of Sheba and custodian of immense treasures. His throne and ring symbolize the treasure hard to attain, a metaphor for the self, and Solomon naturally emerges as a figure of authority in alchemical writings. Wolfram's familiarity with alchemical ideas is suggested by his description of the Grail as a stone through whose power the phoenix is consumed by fire in order to rise renewed from the ashes. This allegorical motif was significant in alchemy. While the traditional phoenix legend mentions no stone, it describes the bird collecting inflammable resins in its nest. In another context, the Lancelot Grail speaks of the bird Serpillion, which is burned by a stone called pyrrhostite, brought from the Vale of Hebron to warm its young, whom it then feeds. Paralleling the Grail feeding those under its protection, this combines the imagery of the phoenix and the pelican. The name Serpillion likely means serpent bird, echoing the Persian semenda, a combination of snake and bird, symbolizing the instinctive dual nature of the unconscious. The motif of the phoenix and the stone in Wolfram thus links the Grail with distinctly alchemical ideas. The epithet exilis, poor, mean, recalls a familiar characteristic of the philosopher's stone, repeatedly described as worthless, thrown onto dunghills, or trodden underfoot. Even in antiquity, the alchemist Zosimos observed that the lapis was despised and highly honored, not given and given by God. It has also been suggested that the Grail's identification as a stone arose from a confusion with the stone table, or because it was imagined as a portable altar on which the host, brought by the dove, was laid. This notion again associates the Grail with the stone sealing Christ's sepulchre. Eastern legends connect it further to the stone struck by Moses in the desert to provide water for the children of Israel. Alchemists likened it to their lapis, and the Aurora Consurgens describes the lapis as a treasure founded upon a sure rock, which cannot be split except by striking it 3 times with Moses' rod to release water for all people. Wolfram's treatment thus weaves together related ideas. The properties he ascribes to the Grail, bestowing youth and longevity, mirror those of the lapis philosophorum. Another related line of thought points to the Ark of the Covenant in Solomon's temple, which rested on a rock and contained 4 sacred objects: Aaron's rod, Moses' tables of the law, a golden candelabra, and the urn of manna. The sacred urn was believed to have disappeared, hidden perhaps beneath paving stones, inspiring much mystical speculation. These 4 objects may also symbolize the 4 functions of consciousness. If the sword and lance represent thinking and intuition, then the Grail, which bestows blessings such as joy only upon the worthy, corresponds to the function of feeling, concerned with consent and discrimination. Yet the Grail encompasses far more than feeling alone. It is described as a stone of purest kind, and demands purity from its guardians. It may be carried only by a virgin without guile, in whose hands it is light. In the grasp of the base, it is impossible to lift. Likewise, the Arabic alchemist Alphidius states that the stone's mother was virginal, unknown to its father. The Aurora Consurgens calls it the stone of chastity, further reflecting its close connections with alchemy. When all its aspects are considered, whether as a wondrous stone, a sacred vessel, or a relic, the Grail is found to possess remarkable qualities. It provides material sustenance according to need, offers spiritual consolation, preserves youth, and sustains life. On occasion, it heals knights wounded in battle. It radiates light and emits a sweet fragrance, brings joy to the heart, and renders those who behold it incapable of sin for that day. It distinguishes between good and evil, remaining invisible to the unbaptized. It communicates the will of God through inscriptions upon it. Only the one destined by heaven, whose name is written thereon, can discover the Grail. It also dictates the lover its guardian may have, as in the case of Anfortas, who chose the beautiful Aurgelus as his companion. In her service, he pursued fame as a knight and, in battle, suffered a wound from a poisoned spear that refused to heal. Through this event, the Grail acquires a psychological significance pointing toward Eros. It seems to express a judgment on the man's choice in love, guiding his relationship with the anima. In medieval Menedienst, there existed a dual tendency, toward an individual realization of the anima and toward a personal bond with a woman. However, the rise of the cult of the Virgin curtailed both tendencies, so the anima remained primarily an archetypal symbol. As Anforta's fate demonstrates, moments of individual choice were fraught with peril. Yet the Grail served as a guiding image amid the complexities engendered by the anima, embodying the totality of the individual and directing development toward a higher purpose. The Grail's extraordinary attributes, which justify its designation as a treasure hard to attain, and its close analogy to the alchemical stone, sometimes fully identified with it in Wolfram, support its interpretation as a symbol of the self. In many versions, it is a relic of Christ's blood, linking the symbol of the self with the Christ image. The funerary aspect and the presence of blood emphasize the Grail's connection to the stage of psychic development that preserves the efficacy and soul substance of Christ after his earthly death. As depicted in the Gospels, Jesus' figure is often indistinct and inconsistent. It attains significance only because symbolic images of the self, such as the fish, the cross, and the Son of Man, crystallized around it from the depths of the collective unconscious. Consequently, the figure of Jesus became identified with the concept of the self, acquiring the substance and reality that anchor it at the core of Christian culture. All contemporary projections of the archetype of the incarnate God, the self, which were constellated in human consciousness at the time, attached themselves to Jesus' figure. This significance would have diminished had individuals, notably beginning with the Apostle Paul, not repeatedly experienced inner psychic states they recognized as identical with Christ. Psychologically, the enduring power that sustains the Christ symbol can be understood as the innate pattern of individuation, which, across all ages, can generate a Christ-like image of the self in each human being, ensuring its continued presence and influence in the world of men. From this perspective, the Grail can also be understood as an image of the transcendent function. This function denotes the psychic synthesis of consciousness and the unconscious, enabling the totality of the psyche, the self, to come into awareness. It is therefore responsible for the continual maturation and transformation of the God image, the self, and can symbolically appear as the vessel in which the soul substance of the God is preserved. Although the vessel and its contents are fundamentally identical, there remains a subtle difference in the choice of imagery. The stone in alchemy signifies the inner spiritual man. Its divine qualities mark it as a particle of God hidden within nature, analogous to the God who, in Christ, descended to earth in a human body subject to suffering. The cheapness of the stone, however, points to the fact that every human being is its potential bearer, even its creator. In this way, the alchemical lapis compensates for the overly exalted and distant spirituality of the ecclesiastical image of Christ, which is too far removed from natural human experience. One might object that the wafer of the host, before consecration, is also lifeless matter, and once consecrated, it becomes the body of Christ. The medieval fascination with transubstantiation shows how deeply significant was the incorporation of material elements into speculation about God. Yet the Eucharist did not suffice for an answer. Perhaps the material substance involved was too small. For this reason, the alchemists pursued the problem further, exploring the presence of the divine within matter. Some, such as Petrus Bonus, Melchior Sibonensis, and the author of the Aurora Consurgens, saw an analogy between the transubstantiation of the Mass and the alchemical opus. In the alchemical vision, the lapis allows the flesh to glorify itself without transforming into spirit. Instead, it fixes the spirit within the stone. The lapis may thus be understood as a symbol of the inner Christ, God within man. Seen in this light, the stone represents a further development of the Christ symbol, reaching into matter itself. The alchemist, unknowingly, extends the notion of Christ's intermatio, concluding that complete assimilation to the Redeemer enables him, as the assimilated, to continue the work of redemption within his own psyche. In this process, the divine spirit imprisoned in matter can be liberated, not by the ego, but through the activity of the self. Thus, the symbol of the lapis originates not in conscious thought, but in the border regions of the psyche that open into the mystery of cosmic matter. The lapis represents a symbolic self analogous to Christ, yet enriched by its return to the depths of matter and the physical, introducing a complementary darker dimension. While the essential material substance of the self is emphasized in the stone, the vessel highlights another facet, the necessity of psychic comprehension. A vessel, though material, serves to contain and give form to other substances. This function implies that the image of the self, the Christ within, cannot truly exist unless it is realized within the human soul. This discussion concerns a long, ongoing process of historical development in which the God image, initially experienced as entirely transcending consciousness, gradually withdraws from its projection onto a purely metaphysical reality and increasingly penetrates the human realm. This movement first appears in the mythological representations of god-men, such as Gilgamesh, Tammuz, and Osiris, in the various versions of these myths. The next stage occurs in the doctrine of the incarnation of God in a single, historically real person, Jesus, whereby God fully descends into the tangible here and now of human existence. Because of the significance of this event, the person of Christ became the central focus of theological reflection in the Reformed branches of Christianity. Yet this descent of God into the human realm would have remained incomplete, particularly as the historical figure of Christ belonged to a distant past, if a further step had not been achieved: the recognition of the God-man's actual existence within the soul of every individual. The medieval mystics were the first to articulate this realization with the intensity of personal experience. In parallel, the Grail legend appears as a richly imagistic expression of the same principle. In this sense, the vessel or the stone represents the entire psychic man, not the ego alone, as a manifestation of divinity reaching deep into matter. As the person becomes increasingly conscious, qualities and knowledge previously unconscious, and thus solely attributed to God, gradually enter the sphere of human influence. This development has now advanced to such a degree that, through human mastery of matter, it becomes possible to unleash world-annihilating forces whose destructive power dwarfs the acts of the mythological gods. The ultimate extent of this increasing consciousness of the God image in humanity is unknown. Nevertheless, it imposes on the individual a moral responsibility previously scarcely imagined, as well as a profound obligation to strive for higher consciousness, which entails taking one's own individuation seriously. In this light, Perceval emerges as a symbol of modern humanity, confronted with this immense task. The stone or vessel represents the goal, the realization of the total human being. The prominence of the stone in alchemy, contrasted with the vessel in medieval poetry, may reflect the different approaches of these disciplines. Alchemists, as natural scientists, focused more on the content itself, the divine spirit in matter, whereas poets, guided by emotion, engaged with the same problem in a more intuitive, imaginative, and feminine-oriented form, aptly symbolized by the vessel. Moreover, encountering the Grail imposes a question upon the observer without providing direct knowledge. It symbolizes emotional readiness to receive, still situated within the realm of the anima, rather than offering fully articulated understanding. The nature of this Grail question will be explored later. First, however, the remaining symbols carried in the procession must be examined. The table, one of the remarkable objects in the Grail castle, is symbolically connected to the Grail in multiple ways. A feminine and maternal significance is attached to it, especially in its role in meals. The Latin word mensa, table and food, derives from metia, to measure, allot, or apportion, while menses, month, associated with the moon as a measure of time, comes from the same root. The moon, known as a feminine symbol, the mother, represents the one who measures and apportions sustenance. This idea of measuring links the table back to the vessel, which is also a measure. In the Grail narratives, the table is described as extremely valuable. In Wolfram's Grail procession, where the table follows immediately after the lance, it is made of translucent garnet hyacinth with 2 ivory supports. In Chrétien's version, the supports are of ebony, imperishable because it neither rots nor burns, and the tabletop is ivory. The table is significant not only because the Grail meal is served there, or because the Grail itself is placed upon it, but also for a deeper symbolic meaning within the stories. The Grail tales naturally belong to the Histoires de la Table Ronde, as Arthur's Round Table denotes a circle of chosen knights, primarily his court, and represents, in part, an archaic precursor to the archetypal images Perceval encounters in the Grail castle. For instance, at Perceval's first meeting with Arthur, the king is described as temporarily incapable of action, mirroring the condition of the Grail king, who is also incapacitated. A vessel, the stolen golden cup, plays a significant role in this scene as well. King Arthur's Round Table had been instituted by his father, Uther Pendragon, under the guidance of Merlin, his counselor skilled in magic. It was the last of 3 important tables mentioned in the Quest del Saint Grail. The first was the table of Jesus Christ, where the apostles ate on multiple occasions, a table that sustained body and soul with heavenly food. It was established by the Lamb without blemish, sacrificed for humanity's redemption. The second table, fashioned in likeness and remembrance of the first, was the table of the Holy Grail, where great miracles were witnessed in the land during the time of Joseph of Arimathea, when Christianity was first brought to the earth. Upon this table, by divine command, Joseph placed the Grail, through whose grace he and his company of 4,000 were fed. Joseph had established it following the pattern of the table of the Last Supper, linking the Grail table directly to the sacred tradition of divine sustenance and the spiritual continuity of Christ's presence in the world. In Robert de Boron, Joseph's brother-in-law bronze catches a fish, which is placed on the table beside the Grail, giving rise to the title of the Grail's guardian as the Fisher King. This second table, echoing the first, is explicitly described as square, in accordance with divine command. Arthur's table, by contrast, is round. The quest explains that the round table, established on Merlin's council, was not set up without deep symbolic meaning. Its roundness signifies the roundness of the world and the arrangement of planets, elements, and the firmament. Through the stars and other celestial conditions, the round table is understood to symbolize the entire universe. This notion recalls other tables, partly historical and partly legendary. Charlemagne, along with his 12 peers, evokes Christ and the apostles and serves as a prototype for Arthur and his round table. Charlemagne was said to possess a precious table depicting the universe in 3 concentric circles, the first showing the earth and its atmosphere, the second the sun, moon, and planets, and the third the fixed stars, thus representing the cosmos. Some scholars suggest that Charlemagne's table may have been modeled after Solomon's famous table, which, according to legend, was made of a massive emerald, or in some versions entirely of gold, richly adorned with pearls and precious stones. This echoes Chrétien's description of the Grail as being of fine gold, set with precious stones in countless varieties. Solomon's legendary treasure, after the fall of Jerusalem, was said to have been transported to Rome and later largely seized by Gothic kings. Contemporary Frankish accounts describe it as including an orbiculus or missorium, a portable altar of solid gold encrusted with gems. When the Saracens conquered the Western Gothic kingdom, their commander Tarik reportedly inquired about Solomon's table upon entering Toledo, and was told it was guarded in a stronghold belonging to the nephew of the last Gothic king. There is a notable parallel between Solomon's table and the Grail table guarded by the king or his nephew in the castle. The coveted table was said to be located in Jibal Suleiman, a mountain or hill in Medinet al-Maida, also called the Town of the Table. Arabic fairy tales and Spanish romances preserve the memory of Solomon's treasure, later kept in Spain and referred to as the Gothic treasure. A celebrated letter of Prester John, known to Wolfram von Eschenbach, recounts a similar table, possibly the same, made of emerald and supported by 2 amethyst uprights. The prominence of green is noteworthy, as Wolfram also presents the Grail carried on a green Okmadi. Green, as the color of vegetation and life, corresponds symbolically with the nature of the Grail. In the Grail castle, the land begins to show green again when Gauvain asks the question concerning the lance. In ecclesiastical symbolism, green represents the Holy Spirit or the anima mundi, and among mystics, it is regarded as the universal color of divinity. In alchemy, the emerald holds a significant role, particularly in connection with the famous Tabula Smaragdina, on which the essence of the alchemical work was recorded in 13 sentences attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. According to various accounts of its discovery, this text was found either in the tomb of an Egyptian king or on a stele, and its origins likely predate Jobir, possibly going back to even older, perhaps Greek, sources. The emerald was regarded as the stone of Hermes. In a text by Apollonios, on primal causes, he describes it as follows. The emerald is a jacket, that is, a corundum, for at the beginning of its formation it is coagulated as a jacket in all its parts. Its natural color is red. Because of the intensity of condensation in the redness, blackness arises, turning it sky-colored. Yet, due to its hardness and coarseness, the celestial hue withdraws inward, leaving the pure red visible on the surface, which then becomes yellow. The heat then boils it violently, mixing the outer and inner colors, producing green. Thus it acquires a green color and is called emerald, though its origin is the jacket. The jacket is related to gold and is the root of all precious stones. Just as gold is the noblest of smeltable metals, fire does not affect the jacket, nor does the iron file. This description mirrors the color changes of classical alchemical operations, nigrido, rubido, citronitas, viriditas, and closely links the emerald to incorruptible gold. To precious stones, it is what gold is to metals, an everlasting, incorruptible substance and the ultimate goal of the opus. In this context, the green color comes to signify life itself. In alchemical texts, the Benedicta Viriditas, the blessed green, represents the beginning of the reanimation of matter. By extension, the table in the Grail stories might be associated, even if indirectly, with a sensory function. First, because it bears material food, and second, because as a cosmic table it embodies a sensory awareness of universal reality. As the table is made of stone, it evokes the stone of the Grail, and as it serves a meal, whether ordinary or ritual, it is life-sustaining, functioning as a supporting base for the Grail itself, and thereby carrying a subtly different nuance of meaning. In the alchemical work Philosophia Reformata by J. D. Mylius, 4 goddesses are depicted sitting at a round table. They represent the 4 seasons and the 4 elements, which in a literal sense are combined around the table. The table, therefore, is more closely associated than the vessel with humanity's endeavor toward the synthesis of totality, which ultimately expresses itself in the vessel, the Grail. The motif of a magic stone holds a central place in Eastern tradition, serving as the foundation stone of the world and as the cornerstone, a symbol of Christ, established in Zion and referred to as the stone which the builders rejected. The holy name of God was said to be engraved upon it, and it was reportedly displayed in front of the Ark of the Covenant in the Temple at Jerusalem. This stone accompanied the children of Israel through the wilderness, and Joshua, son of Nun, was believed to have placed it upon Christ's grave. In this way, it became the altar stone which gives life to all men, since Christ's body as the host rests upon it. The transition from altar stone to altar table was a natural development, especially in the East, where a legend circulated from the 11th century about a red stone brought by angels from Sinai to Jerusalem, later becoming the altar table of the Last Supper. A similar narrative appears in the 5th surah of the Quran, where the apostles ask Jesus if God can send them a table from heaven. Jesus prays, "Lord our God, send us a table from heaven, that it may be a feast day for us, and it shall be a sign from thee, to the first and the last of us. Feed us, for thou art the best provider." The prayer is heard, yet God warns that those who remain unbelieving will be severely punished. A fish appears as the main course, and afterward, because of human sin, the table is taken away. This Islamic tradition incorporates elements reminiscent of the Grail, both in its aspect as a stone and in the role of the table as a miraculous object. The table unites believers and enforces divine judgment, functioning as a symbol of the self in which both synthesis and discernment are contained. The sun table played a significant role in the Orphic mysteries of antiquity. Orpheus is said to have been acquainted with Dionysus' mixing vessel and to have seated many others at the sun table. Vessel and table appear symbolically united, alluding to initiation into the mysteries of Dionysus. Similarly, Hippolytus recounts that among the Naucines, the cup of Anacreon played a role in the divine creation, with the 4 elements forming the world of forms. The cup, as the focus of divine realization, is borne by the table, around which sit those who seek to partake in the mystery. The table's function as the supporting base for the essential symbol of the self parallels the ancient Egyptian myth in which the square floor of heaven, made of a sheet of iron, is upheld at the 4 compass points by the 4 columns of Shu, god of the air, forming a table-like structure. The 4 supporting pillars correspond to the 4 sons of Horus, who assist their grandfather Osiris in ascending to heaven to become the one universal God. The opposing elements must come together in concert to help the one achieve totality. This motif resonates with Ezekiel's vision of the heavens, in which the firmament appears as a crystal stretched over the heads of the living creatures, and above it sits a throne with the appearance of a sapphire stone, upon which stands the likeness of a man. Here, the 4-legged sheet of metal bears the figure of the Son of Man, and a similar image appears in the Gnostic Codex Brucianus, where the monogenes, the only begotten Son, is also described as standing on a table. This table, together with a sheet of metal with 4 wheels in Ezekiel's vision, forms the foundation or vehicle for the empirical self. Its quaternary structure reflects the basis of the God image. It is as if the self requires the consciousness of the individual, composed of 4 functions, as a foundation for its realization, since the quaternity, unlike the circle, symbolizes reflected wholeness. In contrast to the vessel, the table is therefore more closely associated with human effort to achieve consciousness. Through it, all dissociated aspects of the personality can be made conscious and brought into unity. A symbol of the incarnate deity, the Son of God, or, in the Grail story, the wondrous vessel, which functions as a feminine analogy to the Son of Man, then appears on the table. The equal recognition of both aspects reflects the psychological insight that God cannot be experienced unless the fragile ego provides a modest vessel to receive the effluence of the Most High. Attention must also be given to the plate mentioned in Critian and the 2 silver knives referred to by Wolfram. Little is known about the role of the silver plate in the Grail procession. Some scholars view it as a pattern, or the object known in the Greek liturgy of Saint Chrysostom as the discus, carried with other sacred items. In the Welsh Parida, the Grail is replaced by a dish, on which the severed head of the lord of the castle's kinsman is carried, requiring vengeance. It has also been suggested that the word toira might mean knife, derived from toira, to cut. In Wolfram, 2 silver knives are used to scrape poison from a wound, while in the legend of the cloister of Fécamp, knives appear for scraping blood from Christ's wounds. The prevailing view, however, is that toira more likely refers to a plate. In Critian, another silver plate appears, on which a hind is carved. The plate may also have been used to serve the host to the king. Its silver composition allows a symbolic connection with the alchemical lapis in its albedo stage, when the stone appears white or silver like the moon. As a round object, the plate represents the self, like the lapis. However, while the table represents the collective aspect of bringing the self into consciousness, gathering many people for a communal meal, the plate illustrates a more individual application of the same transcendent function, as it is from the plate that each person receives their share of wholeness. Wolfram provides the following explanation for the knives. The sick king suffered intensely during the changes of the moon, when a chill seized him and his flesh became colder than ice. The spear was laid on the wound so that the hot poison could run into it while the cold was drawn from the body. The poison then adhered to the spear like ice and could not be removed until Trebuchet, the wise smith, forged 2 silver knives with which it could be scraped away. Outside of this account, the knives appear nowhere else in Parzival. Some have suggested that they resulted from a misunderstanding, with Wolfram taking the word toira, plate, as toira, to carve, and thus describing silver knives instead of a plate. The knives, however, appear in another tradition that may have influenced the Grail legend, even if subtly. In the legend of the Holy Blood of Fécamp, modelled on the Gospel of Nicodemus, it is recounted that at the consecration of the first monastery church at Fécamp, a white-haired man placed a knife on the altar, inscribed to dedicate the church to the Holy Trinity. This knife may be the same one Nicodemus used to scrape Christ's blood. When the blood was discovered, a small cylinder containing a piece of iron, resembling part of a lance, was also found. This connection sheds light on why, in Parzival, the 2 silver knives are used to scrape poison from Anforta's wounds when his condition is most severe, and are carried in the Grail procession. The knives are further linked with a small lance or lance-like knife in the liturgy of Saint Chrysostom. During the preparation for communion, intended to symbolize the slaying of the lamb, a square portion of the consecrated loaf is cut and marked with a cross. The 4 resulting pieces symbolize the Lamb of God to be sacrificed. Across various versions, the knives maintain the consistent function of completing or continuing the work of the lance, either cleaning the lance itself or cleansing Christ's body of the blood from the injury inflicted by Longinus' lance. In the Fécamp legend, the knife appears even to have been made from the iron of the lance. Psychologically, the knife, like the sword, represents a function of discriminating thought and judgment. The presence of 2 knives in Wolfram indicates that this function, thinking, is still in its early stages and partly coincides with the enlightening impulse represented by the lance emerging from the unconscious, or is just beginning to separate from it. The knives, in taking the place of the broken sword of conscious reasoning, represent a new form of thinking drawn directly from the unconscious, making it more capable of engaging with its contents than conscious reflection alone. This emerging mental attitude foreshadows the alchemical approach and the psychological mode of thought it inspired. The knives were intended to eliminate the Grail King's poisonous blood, the dried and ineffective psychic residue of the Christ symbol. Yet, because the Grail stories were composed by poets, this new form of understanding was apprehended symbolically and perceived visually as it arose from the unconscious. The alchemists, in contrast, labored to extract from matter, that is, from the unconscious itself, a sensus naturae, or light of nature, and a mode of thought, the symbolic, essentially psychological thinking contained within it. For this reason, many of their texts recommend working on the head, skull, or brain of a human being to extract the thinking from it. The thinking drawn from the unconscious is symbolized here by the two knives and serves to protect the lance, or imago Christi, from the desiccated residue. In other words, behind the imago Christi stands the self, and what the self attains is cultivated through thinking achieved by self-knowledge, thereby safeguarding it from the sterilizing effects of mere intellect. All the principal objects observed by Perceval in the Grail Castle have now been considered. Psychologically, they appear to point to the individuation process as the aim and object of the developmental path decreed for him. The Grail Castle experience, which may be understood as a dream or vision, provides the hero with the guidance for his life's task and constitutes the first stage in his achievement of consciousness. This stage involves a union of this world with the world beyond consciousness, a contact between consciousness and the unconscious, and the integration of the totality symbolized by the quaternity of objects. In a broader sense, Perceval himself represents a type analogous to Christ, comparable to the Homo altus or Homo quadratus of the alchemists, as someone in whom the progressive workings of the Holy Spirit seek to manifest.